So, early in 2015 I decided to embark on a PhD, and some people think that was a moment of madness, including myself. Since then I've systematically collected, transcribed, coded, linked and analysed data from several data sets to a greater or lesser extent. My overall aim was to reconstruct the convict population that arrived in Van Diemen's Land in the years 1830 to 1835, and to investigate several unresolved issues regarding their distribution and punishment. Now, my purpose today is not to talk about my research findings, but to focus on how good descriptive data has been important to me in developing my research and how I've utilised resources in your holdings. One of the things that attracted me to my topic was the abundance of surviving records. My research, whoops, what happened then? There we go. My research relies heavily on large data sets held by the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office, including appropriation lists, conduct records, the Hobart Town Gazette and the correspondence of the Colonial Secretary's Office. It also relies heavily on the National Library of Australia's wonderful collection of digitised newspapers and the National Archives UK collection of annual nominal returns, commonly referred to as musters. All these records provide information about both convicts and their masters and mistresses. Almanacs and street directories are also important sources that help to identify the masters and mistresses' places of residence, and description lists fill in details of convicts' places of origin and age on arrival and so on that is missing from most of appropriation lists. I've also tapped various other sources, including some comprised of single volumes or of single items. A central task for my project was to transcribe all the available appropriation lists for convict ships that arrived between the 1st of January 1830 and the 31st of December 1835. And after committing myself, I learnt that there were 60 major convict vessels that arrived in that period, and I found that at least one appropriation list survives for 57 of those. As you might already know, the relevant appropriation lists are in 3 separate record series. And as far as I know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there's no consolidated index to those appropriation lists. And only the Con 27 series, or at least most of it, is viewable online. Altogether, I've located 97 lists for 57 ships. I've found, in fact, that there is a different appropriation list in each of the 3 series for each of 5 male ships, and close examination reveals the order or the sequence of their creation. There are also 2 non-identical appropriation lists for each of another 30 ships, again created sequentially and located in 2 distinct record series. On this slide you can see my transcription of what appears in the How Appropriated columns on the Con 27 and the CSO1 appropriation lists for 6 of the women who arrived on the America in 1831. You can see that the CSO1 list identifies a master or mistress for each of 5 women who were either sick or unassigned on the Con 27 list. And you can see that another woman's proposed assignment changed. One historian writing in 2003 believed that there were no extant appropriation lists for this ship or for another one called the Hydri, when in fact there are 2 for this ship and 1 for the Hydri. And that's understandable given the scattered state of the archive and the lack of a consolidated index. Since no 2 lists are identical in every detail, I've meticulously transcribed all the unique data from each of the 97 lists that I've found, including the crossings out, and those transcriptions have been added to the Founders and Survivors database, where they're linked then with transcriptions of other record groups pertaining to the same convicts. So all going well, no one will ever have to transcribe these appropriation lists again. At least one appropriation list survives for 10 of the 11 female convict ships that arrived in the years 1830 to 1835. Now, I'm not just interested in the female, but I'll mention these. The odd one out, the one out of those 11 that doesn't have an appropriation list, was a ship called the Jane, which arrived on the 30th of June 1833. And I was quite pleased to find that something that effectively substitutes for an appropriation list for the Jane exists in Con 139, which is, as far as I know, the only surviving register of admissions to the Hobart House, Female House of Correction or Female Factory. It was a bonus to find that that had been digitised and made available online. The register covers only the 10-month period from June 1833 to March 1834, but that's sufficient to include the arrivals of the Jane and another female ship called the William Bryan. Each of the women who arrived spent at least one night in the female factory before they departed for their places of assignment. And this register includes the prisoners' names, the number of days each remained in the factory, whether they were sick or had infant children, and to whom or to where they were discharged. So it is, in some ways, even better than an appropriation list. And knowing the names of the convicts' masters and mistresses is very important to my project, but anyone who's examined an appropriation list would know that the names written in the How Appropriated column are not always easy to read. And someone else mentioned something about old records and how hard they can be to read this morning. Well, I turned to 3 other record sets that potentially contained legible versions of the same names. Musters, lists of assignments, loans and transfers published in the Hobart Town Gazette, and conduct records. Now, of course, a muster only helps if the convict actually went to the master or mistress named in the appropriation list, and if he or she stayed long enough to appear assigned to that master or mistress in a muster that survives. So you've got a few ifs. The Hobart Town Gazette helps only if the convict was male and arrived or was transferred during or after September 1832, because that's when it started publishing lists of assignments, loans and transfers for males and not for females. A conduct record is only helpful with the additional proviso that the convict faced a magistrate while serving that initial master or mistress. So that's why you've got to try one thing. If that doesn't work, you try another. Fortunately, one or the other of these record types has helped solve the illegibility problem in virtually every case that I've come across, and we're talking probably, of all the 97 lists I looked at, probably a couple of hundred times. There were names that I could not make out without trying these other sources. Knowing where the masters and mistresses lived and how they earned a living are just as important for my project as knowing their names. Now, while officials and clerks took a great deal of effort to identify each convict uniquely, they took far less care identifying masters and mistresses, and least of all by their occupations. They recorded the first names or initials of about half the masters and mistresses, the places of residence of about 1/3, and the occupations of only about 1 in every 100. It was necessary for me to fill in the blanks. Contemporaneous almanacs and street directories, sorry about the blurry image, are obvious sources of both addresses and occupations, but they are not much use if all you have to go on is a surname, especially if it's Smith. But there are plenty of other names. Despite the small size of the population, many settlers' surnames were not unique in the colony, and many convicts, such as labourers or domestic servants, could have served masters or mistresses of almost any description. So we'll take 2 convicts as illustrative examples. Alfred Jones was a groom and house servant, and Louisa Goslin was a cook. Each was assigned to a Mr. Horn, but as neither the master's initial or given name, place of residence or occupation appear on the appropriation lists, it's unclear which Mr. Horn and where. Now, I've been able to identify 5 men called Mr. Horn living in Van Diemen's Land at the precise time that these 2 convicts arrived, and 2 of those don't appear in any almanacs. I found them in Trove searches and in the Tasmanian Names Index. What did we ever do without Trove and the Tasmanian Names Index? I don't know. Benjamin Horn was a magistrate and a farmer near the town of Ross. Thomas Horn was a barrister in Hobart Town. His brother Alfred was a police magistrate and coroner at Circular Head. James Horn was a waterman in Hobart Town, and a Mr. Horn is identified as a carpenter without a given name recorded in in a Hobart Town directory. Now, you may have noticed that 4 of those Mr. Horns had their first initial was different. Each of them had a different first initial. So if I could only find a record of each convict with the master's first initial, each of these 2 convicts with the master's first initial recorded, I'd probably be able to identify him or distinguish him from the others. So, again, the initials or given names of masters and mistresses were sometimes recorded on musters when they weren't recorded on appropriation lists. But in this case, neither the male nor the female convict assigned to a Mr. Horn remained with their master long enough to be identified as his servant on a surviving muster. Lists of assignments and transfers published in the Hobart Town Gazette usually included the places of residence of the masters and mistresses, but no such lists appeared before September 1832, and then only in relation to male convicts. As one of the convicts here was female, and as the male convict arrived in 1830, the Hobart Town Gazette was of no use to me. Gave me no clue to the identity or place of residence of either Mr. Horn, if they're 2 different ones at all. No offence committed in the service of Mr. Horn appears on Alfred Jones's conduct record, and so the identity and place of residence of his proposed master remains a mystery. In fact, Alfred Jones probably never actually went to that master, never actually entered his service. He first faced a magistrate less than 3 months after his arrival, when he wasn't in private service but engaged in public works. I have an eyelash in my eye. Louisa Goslin's conduct record, however, indicates that Mr. Horn took her before the Principal Superintendent, PS, the person responsible for hearing the cases of all female convicts assigned within the boundaries of Hobart Town. So we can eliminate Benjamin Horn, the farmer and magistrate near Ross, and Alfred Horn, the police magistrate at Circular Head. And of the 3 Mr. Horns in Hobart Town, Thomas Horn, the barrister, is most likely to have been Louisa's master, firstly because a waterman and a carpenter were unlikely to have a female assigned servant, and secondly because the offence she committed was more likely to have occurred in a barrister's home. Louisa's first and only offence in Mr. Horn's service was turning the tap of a beer barrel with a fork for the purpose of drawing off beer without permission, and afterwards locking the storeroom door, whereby the beer was floating over the room. Big mistake. The positive aspect of Louisa's offence is that it helps identify her master and her place of assignment. It's been necessary for me to repeat this process, either all or some of this process, hundreds of times, in order to identify the places of residence and occupations of as many as possible of the masters and mistresses of convicts who arrived in the years 1830 to 1835. This makes it possible to map. We've heard a lot about mapping today. This would make it possible to map the distribution literally of newly arrived convicts in those years, and to determine the extent to which convict administrators matched convicts according to their skills or skill sets with the settlers. who would have need of their particular skills, and to investigate various other issues. But none of this would be possible without the wonderful resources provided by people like you here in the library and online. So thank you to all involved. There.